Hi there, friend. I'm starting a new series of Canadian history, and I thought, why not start with the most important event of the 21st century? No, it wasn't Justin Trudeau becoming Prime Minister, nor is it the left-wing NDP winning the right-wing Alberta. No, it's not even that time that Stephen Harper challenged Bonhomme to a kicking contest. No, today, we're here to talk about the 2004 federal election. A good story requires characters, and boy, does this story have characters. The story of Paul Martin begins way back in 1989. John Turner, the most unsuccessful Liberal Prime Minister in the history of Canada, is now the leader of the weakest official opposition party in Canadian history.
I have a monopoly on patriotism, and I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
He decides he is going to step down and that someone else should take his place. Paul Martin owns a multi-billion-dollar shipping business and decides to throw his hat into the race and finances a multi-million-dollar campaign to make sure that he wins. He has image consultants, advertising firms, and purchasing hundreds of delegate memberships. This might seem a bit odd and forward, kind of like Donald Trump-ish. But this is par for the course in Canadian history. Lots of elected people were actually quite wealthy and bopped their way into office. Hell, the country was formed by an owner of the largest rail company buying John A. Macdonald and his influence. But with all the money he spent, in the end he loses it to Jean Chrétien. Jean Chrétien is quite the odd duck. He can't string a sentence together for the life of him and is ugly as sin from his Bell's policy.
Last night, the Conservative Party reached a new low. They tried to make fun of the way I look. God gave me a physical defense. And I've accepted that since I'm a kid.
But Chrétien was a party loyalist and was a former finance minister under Pierre Elliott Trudeau. While this is happening, the ruling PCs are falling apart and their supporters nosediving. Their popular leader Brian Mulroney leaves the party and Kim Campbell is given leadership leading into an election. The Liberals won in 1993 as PC numbers dipped. PC numbers dipped so much that a split happened in the Canada's right-wing movement. But hey, more about that later. In front of the cameras they were friends, but behind the cameras they were brutal enemies. When Jean Chrétien took Prime Minister, he made sure that all of his ministers were his friends. He even went as far to appoint Newfoundland Premier Brian Tobin as Minister of Fisheries without a seat in government. Chrétien loyalists were Alan Rock, John Manley, Stéphane Dion, Sheila Copps, all of which received very good positions in the party. Paul Martin was sated by being given the position of Minister of Finance, considered by many to be the second best job in government. The 90s were a good time to be a Liberal. Paul Martin was slashing programs left and right until eventually we hit a surplus budget. Yay! Once we hit a surplus budget, it just seemed like an endless supply of surplus budgets, and people knew that Canada was booming again. The Liberals could do no wrong. However, Quebec sovereignty was becoming a big issue, and this opportunity was taken to do some pretty illegal party financing. Starting in 1994, the Parti Québécois began advertising pro-sovereignty commercials suggesting that Quebec should leave Canada. In 1995, the Government of Canada began paying for pro-Canada commercials suggesting Quebec should stay in Canada. The Government of Canada would pay a non-bid tender to a particular advertising firm. This advertising firm would use a portion of the money for advertisements, but then it would take a large sum of the remainder and donate it back to the Liberal Party. Another large sum was, of course, never actually spent and was held as bonuses for the firm. Alternative schemes saw these advertising firms setting up charity dinners for the party. Of the $15 million spent on advertising, around $2 million of it would end up in the Liberal Party coffers. This became known as the unholy war chest of the Liberal Party and allowed them to gain an unfair funding advantage for many years. Eventually, legislation would come in place to ban corporate donations, but that was 10 years away from this. There was no major investigation into this over the years. People asked questions, but the Liberals were simply too popular and nothing really came of it. The Liberals stopped Quebec from separating, all the while being around for Canada's biggest boom ever. Things all came tumbling down in 2002 when Jean Chrétien insisted that he was planning to give up his position as Prime Minister, and would
Got a moment, Prime Minister?
Pars Martin, what is up?
Jean, I was just wondering if maybe you had reconsidered your decision not to retire?
Suspiciously around this time, Brian Tobin stepped down and resigned his seat as MP. Many still suspect that Paul Martin bullied him out of government. Alan Rock and Sheila Copps both threw their hat into the leadership race, as did Paul Martin. Paul Martin spent millions of dollars again to try and get the nomination.
Let's see nothing wrong in town. No. When a Newfoundlander says, boy, all right, that means he's pretty good.
I support Paul Martin because he's fresh, he's someone I've been waiting for.
Ouvert également au Québec et à nos, donc à l'écoute justement de nos revendications.
He will have a voice for the West, which is desperately required.
He had a good job as Minister of Finance. I think he has the knack of picking out good people, you know.
During this time, Chrétien decided to spite Martin and dropped him as finance minister. In his place, he appointed John Manley, who would be the finance minister right up until he was bullied out of the party by Paul Martin. At the convention, Paul Martin won, with an uncontestable result. The following day, he fired half of the ministers and replaced them with his own people. Alan Rock and Sheila Copps were both dropped to very, very weak ministries at the same time, but they didn't quit. No, Paul Martin forced them out. Paul Martin's popularity numbers were astronomical, and everyone thought that when the election time came in, there was going to be another majority government. So, Paul Martin took the time to get rid of Chrétien's loyalists and parachute in his own brand of VIPs into various seats. Sheila Copps found that in her riding organization, she lost to someone not even from her riding. The same fate came for Alan Rock. All of this was happening on the national stage, and the Chrétienites were losing their seats and were airing their grievances to the media. It was a Liberal Party civil war, a break between the party's slight left and slight right wings. Some joined up with the NDP, others just campaigned against the Liberals. Things are really bad. Young Steve Harper starts off as a PC and serves on their staff, but he grows disillusioned with the party and joins a new ragtag group called the Reform Party. The Reformers are this right-wing group from Alberta who are making waves with their new open party concept. As part of their official mandate, they allow for far more free votes than other parties. People must win in an open and fair seat selection process, and most importantly, it is a grassroots-based organization. No corporate donations. The party is led by another weirdo who isn't particularly beautiful and not particularly articulate.
And provide a constructive alternative. I think constructiveness ought to be the watchword.
Preston Manning. Preston Manning would eventually get corrective dental surgery and go to a speech therapist to try and make the Reform Party a national force. Steve Harper wins his first seat in 1993 and serves a 4-year term. After this, he is offered a job as a lobbyist for the National Citizens Coalition. During this time, the PC Party and Reform Party are both suffering, and it appears that one will eventually wipe out the other. The PC Party keeps shrinking and shrinking, but a different effect is happening. It is found that they are splitting the right-wing vote so much that perhaps both will no longer exist. Steve Harper, it's Stephen now, guys. Stephen Harper and Tom Flanagan come up with a doctrine to unite the right under the United Mutual Principles, using the Reform's open party concept to attract the possibility of managing disagreements. Eventually, the two parties kind of merge, but not really. A large chunk of the PC members get together with a large chunk of the Reform guys and form a new band called the Canadian Alliance. The Liberals play on the fact that they hated abortions and gays and drive any centrist Canadians far, far away from this brand new party. On top of this, Joe Clark has come back with revenge. He keeps the PC brand alive and runs an election with them, continuing the right-wing vote split. The PCs are basically dead in the water. At the very boring and inconsequential leadership nomination, it goes between Peter MacKay and Scott Bryson. Peter MacKay wins, promising to never merge the PCs with the Canadian Alliance. And then he totally just does that. They become the Conservative Party of Canada, and butthurt Scott Bryson crosses the floor and fears there's an anti-gay culture in the party. Another gay conservative, John Baird, formally endorses the party despite their official pledge to recognize marriage as being between a man and a woman. When the leadership bid comes for this brand new party in December of 2003, it is done in a very rushed format because everyone knows an election is looming. Stephen Harper is ushered in as the leader of this new party. The election comes so fast that they haven't even officially registered as a party. They have two staffs and are essentially two parties. Harper runs the Reform side of the party, while Peter MacKay becomes his second in command, running the PC side of the party. The NDP were a Saskatchewan farmer protest party that fought for socialism, public health care, unions, and all that sort of stuff. If this party was formed in America, they would have been deported to Soviet Russia a long time ago. Although they have never been in power in federal politics, they have held power in Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, and recently, Alberta. They're that party that everyone's aware of, but very few people will actually vote for. The bigger parties tend to take mayors, police chiefs, and justices into their party. The NDP take mayoral candidates, police officers, and justice clerks. The NDP government in Alberta has a Safeway grocer, 4 college students, 2 stay-at-home moms who don't actually participate in government, and a school bus driver. An old motto of the party is that you will find yourself in your government with an NDP government. Jack Layton was pulled from Toronto City Council to take over the NDP. He was very outspoken in City Council on social justice issues and was often considered to be a top contender for Toronto City Mayor. Layton was competing against 2 party old-timers who were the token guys who always wanted leadership just in case no one else applied for the job, a civil rights lawyer, and a guy who never served in politics but thought, screw it, let's put our name on the ballot and see what happens. Layton won the nomination with flying colors. Election planning for the NDP is a little bit different than the other parties. The big parties are thinking about winning, and the NDP are thinking about how do we lose less than previous years. The goal of the NDP in this election was to hit 40 seats out of 300, and Layton began campaigning the second he was elected, and would campaign right up until the last election day. Layton was more or less the Bernie Sanders of Canadian politics. Jack Layton would be joined by former leader Ed Broadbent.
Guess who's back?
He's back.
Ha! Who's back?
Ed is back.
Say what?
I'm the one you all should know. Once more popular than Trudeau. Voters deserve a kick at the can. Come out now, Martin. Fight like a man. I'll melt the ice like a warm Chinook. With social justice and a great left hook.
Say what? Guess who's back?
Ed is back.
Guess who's back?
Ed's back. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. It's time for voting. NDP. Still the conscience of the nation. The NDP train. Leaving the station.
Guess who's back?
He's back.
Ha! Who's back?
Ed is back.
Say what?
If you have doubts that we'll be back, then listen up. You don't know Jack.
Guess who's back?
He's back.
Ha! Who's back?
Ed is back.
In 1993, the Bloc Québécois became a real force in politics, becoming the official opposition. Their leader, Lucien Bouchard, had created a bloc of progressive conservative voters and liberal voters, all towards the cause of Quebec separatism. The party's second-in-command, Gilles Duceppe, was a sharp wit, able to ask the damning questions and take other leaders to force. The Bloc Québécois and Parti Québécois began funding separatism information and commercials in Quebec, which inevitably would lead to the 1997 separatism vote. The answer was yes or no, as to whether or not Quebec would leave Canada. And Quebec voted yes to leave Canada. This caused a big uproar because the Liberals really didn't think Quebec wanted to go. A judge ruled that one vote cannot separate a country. The Liberals then created the Clarity Act, which set the rules for separation. It is now required that more than 50% of the vote, and it is now required to have a clear and precise question covering the intent. This essentially killed separation and saw Lucien Bouchard leave politics forever. Gilles Duceppe took over the party and was able to stay the official opposition for one more election. But separatism was dying in Canada, and there was no chance for another referendum ever being hosted. Duceppe changed the branding of the party from a separation party to a Quebec First Party. This revitalized the party and saw more interest in it. While Bouchard was unwilling to compete in English debates, Duceppe was present. Duceppe was a bit of a shit disturber in these debates. He would never answer any questions on policy, he would only ever ask questions, and he'd be very much controlling the pacing and responses of the debates. Duceppe became a bit of a kingmaker depending on who he locked his hateful gaze on.
The Bloc has never that, I would say, blind, stupid partisan attitude of saying we're against that proposal because it comes from the Liberal or the NDP or the Tories. We don't mind. The only questions we're asking ourselves, is it good for Quebec's interests or not? If it is, we're supporting it. If not, we're opposing it. I think this is the way the population is expecting their representatives to work in the House of Commons. And I don't know how many times I've heard Mr. Martin saying the Bloc is just there to block and not supporting the bills we're proposing. Well, you know, the figures are saying just the opposite. There were 60 bills passed since the last election. We voted with the Liberals 82% of the time.
The stage is set for an election. People expect Paul Martin will get a majority. The Conservative Party will be the official opposition. The NDP will fail, and the Bloc will just cease to exist. Paul Martin calls the election only a couple weeks after the Conservative conference. The Conservatives aren't even an official party yet. Awkwardly, someone registers for the PC party and runs one candidate. Shortly after the election call, the Auditor General releases information about the sponsorship scandal. It's kind of a big deal. Martin's numbers drop overnight as all three opposition parties begin declaring corruption. Initial numbers have corruption in the billions, which is a lot more damning than the real number, which was in the millions. On top of this, now Paul Martin has all the people he acts actively working against him, making sure that he wouldn't gain key support from the left of center voters in the Liberal Party. Paul Martin is a lot like Richard Nixon, a real gargoyle. When you listen to him, he speaks very well and he makes very good points. When you see him, he looks very uncomfortable with the left-wing topics he's speaking with.
We are a nation of minorities. And what that means is that all minorities must protect each other. And it is the responsibility of the Prime Minister to defend the Charter of Rights. And the Prime Minister cannot cherry-pick among rights that he happens to like or ones that he doesn't happen to like. He must defend all rights. And the problem, is that Mr. Harper's position simply is not sustainable. Mr. Harper wants to reopen the issue, the charter issue of same-sex marriage, and he would take away a charter right. Now, to do that, you have to use the notwithstanding clause. Now, that's not just what I say. There are 134 constitutional scholars who have come out and said there is no other alternative. And I believe it's wrong to take away people's rights. I believe the job of the Prime Minister is to protect them, not just the ones you happen to agree with. Mr. Harper has two incompatible positions. His position is not sustainable, and his integrity demands that he tell Canadians, in fact, what his true policies and agenda are.
Mr. Layton.
There were a large number of topics in the campaign that split Canadians up. The big one wasn't even a scandal. The big one was gay rights, in particular gay marriage. The Reform Party over the years had taken a very hardline stance on social issues. They hated abortions, they hated gays, they hated Aboriginals, and every single time the party tried to make a statement, there would be some obscure candidate who would make statements that would affect the entire party.
Pardon? Lie about anything. What's the matter with you?
Over here, Robin. Over here. Robin, here. What are you saying? He didn't lie about anything? Why would you say that?
Of course not. What is the... You guys and your fantasy scandals amount to zero. You're the one who didn't ever cheat on your tax return? Duffy made a bit of cheating on his tax return, and you're turning it into an issue.
What's your name, sir? Sorry, what's your... So wait a second. Why do you think that he has no right to ask about the deal? He believes that Mr. Harper knew. Why do you think Mr. Harper didn't know anything?
Because it isn't a deal. It's a nothing. Harper doesn't read income tax forms, you idiot. It's done by the people in the tax department.
But you don't believe that anybody else in that office knew about this deal and kept it?
I believe that you cheat more on your taxes than Duffy ever did.
Why would you say I cheat on my taxes?
Because you're a lying piece of shit.
Their former leader, Stockwell Day, had once called Aboriginals a race-based subsidy. So the Liberal Party pushed the gay marriage as a way to get all the Reform guys to come out and demonize their own party. 1 year later, Canada would pass gay marriage, but it brought out the Conservative stance that no one really expected. They would allow it to go to a free vote, and the will of the people would go forward. The Liberals even went further to say they would amend the Constitution to remove a specific ability called the Notwithstanding Clause. This power allowed the federal government to nullify any question made by a court. This clause could hypothetically make a government prevent gay marriage in jurisdictions that already accept it. Everyone but conservatives supported gay marriage, who simply said they'd let it go to a free vote, and remained non-committal on a stance. A second issue that arose was brought by the Alberta's Ralph Klein. Klein had switched his province over to a two-tiered healthcare system in which private clinics would open up shop and offer private healthcare. These small clinics would be free to Alberta's residents, but everyone else would have to pay. The system proved to be vastly successful, allowing for private capital to open up more locations than other provincial governments could keep up with. Today, most provinces have shifted over to something kind of like this system, but at the same time, it was still a hotly debated topic. Harper, of course, supported the two-tier healthcare system, as it allowed faster results. Martin supported the single-payer system, and mischaracterized the system as being what Americans had. This pivoted Canada's right wing, which is very focused in Western Canada, against Canada's left wing, which is very focused in Quebec and Ontario. Another major issue was Canada's gun registry. This was known as the gun registry boondoggle. The system was pretty simple. All Canadians were required to voluntarily pay the government a sizable fee and register their gun. This would put them on a federal registry that the RCMP could use to track weapons. The problem with the registry was that it only tracked legally acquired weapons from responsible gun owners. It did not track illegal weapons, which kind of defeated the whole purpose of the thing. It turned it into a real tax grab. Martin was trying to maintain his urban voters, where this was a major issue, so he maintained support for the registry. In city, guns are very scary. One gun with so many people around can do a lot of damage. Harper was trying to maintain his rural votes, where this was a major issue, and so he wanted to repeal the gun registry. In rural areas, guns are very scary. If someone comes to your door with a weapon, there are no police or services around to stop it, and so a gun represents the best possible defense from a home invader in rural Canada. Rural farmers use guns to euthanize animals, and hunters use them for killing their prey. But there is a very serious mentality gap between sparse and dense populated areas. The Liberals attempted to use abortion as a wedge issue, but it ended up failing. The NDP tried to talk about healthcare, but mostly fell flat. There was talk about marijuana and electoral reform, but no one really cared. The next biggest issue was something outside of their control. Dalton McGuinty, the Liberal Premier of Ontario, posted his budget, and it was really bad. The Ontario manufacturing industry had all but collapsed, and now they were posting a deficit budget, the biggest they've ever had. All the Martin magic had worn off of Canada, and now floundering in growth. The news that the Liberals could fail sent waves through Ontario, giving the Conservative Party support where they had none. All those factors led to Harper, with increasing popularities across Canada, and it seemed like Harper was going to win it. Martin had a powerful advertising campaign that did very well with Canadians. It was called Choose Your Canada. The campaign would contrast a Canada without Paul Martin and one with Paul Martin. The one without, of course, is terrible, ruined environment, American healthcare, all the bad things, none of the good things.
Stephen Harper would have sent our troops to Iraq. He'd spend billions on tanks and aircraft carriers, weaken our gun laws, and scrap the Kyoto Accord. He'd sacrifice Canadian-style healthcare for U.S.-style tax cuts. He won't protect a woman's right to choose. And he's prepared to work with the Bloc Québécois. Stephen Harper says when he's through with Canada, we won't recognize it. You know what? He's right. This message brought to you by the Liberal Party of Canada.
The final moment to usher in Martin was when Jack Layton accused Paul Martin of literally killing the homeless people with his policies. That kind of hyperbole drove the left-leaning votes to the right-leaning Martin. When election day came around, Paul Martin had won a minority government. Stephen Harper would form the official opposition, and Jack Layton would fall to the fourth-place party. This election represented the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. When it was proven that gods could bleed, people stopped believing in the old gods. The country became very polarized, which all the west and rural ridings went to the Conservatives, and everything else went to the Liberals. The country as a whole made a giant shift to the right. Sick of the NDP and Liberal governments across the country, they chose to elect PC and right-wing governments in their provincial places. Paul Martin would remain Prime Minister for another 2 years. But that's another story.